Hey, everybody, and welcome to Time Out with Kevin Gallagher. It's a pleasure to have you here. We are here every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. if you're watching us on local television. And you can also hear us on the Truth Be Told radio network every, well, not Monday, but Friday night at 9 p.m. Those times are Eastern. You can also check us out on YouTube. You can go to timeoutyoutube.com. That's timeoutyoutube.com. And you can see almost 25 years worth of programming that we've done over that many years. So it's hard to believe we're hitting the 25-year mark of all this. But I have a super fascinating show. And even if you're not a Christian, you're going to find this show really, really fascinating. I had come across this information a long time ago, and through a mutual friend of my guest and myself, and became exposed to it. And most people believe, I guess, that Jesus Christ was born on December 25th, and that's just taken as assumption. But when you actually start looking into what the Bible actually says, and you look at a lot of the things that are being talked about, the Christian mythology, shall we say, about the birth of Christ and what the Bible actually says are really two different things. I will say this to start off before we get to our guest, and that is from the best that we can tell from evidence given in Scripture, and also what we see in the sky, the stars and the alignment of the stars, which is very important. We're going to get into probably some of that tonight, is that the birth of Christ happened on September 11 of the year 3 BC. And if you're counting it a little different way, it could be 2 BC. But it's that date, and it's a very, very interesting date. We're going to get into a lot of this. Tim Kynes is with us. He also has a TV show, a radio show. He's done TV in the past, but he has a radio show, brand new show, by the way, that's on Friday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told radio network. And I want to say welcome, Tim. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
And, give people a little background about yourself, and please add to the introduction that I just gave.
Oh, certainly. Well, as you said, my name is Tim Kynes. I have been a very serious student of the Bible for, let's do the math in my head. About 35 years. And like you, I was introduced to the hypothesis that Jesus was not born on December 25th about 35 years ago, roughly. Okay. And, at first it was, a curiosity. And I read a couple of books, and it was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. But the background to why my research built into such a significant thing for me, it really is the passion. I mean, I'm a pretty accomplished Bible teacher. I've taught all over the world, and I've taught on a wide variety of biblical subjects. But if I had to limit myself to one, this would be it. I would study this for the rest of my life, and I would never be able to exhaust the information. Because what happened was I've got an older brother who's a playwright, and he and I actually read very similar material at the same time. He's also a Christian. We were both introduced to this hypothesis about the same time, okay? And he was actually asked by a good friend and mentor of his if he would write and produce a series of dramatic productions about the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Now, the plan was it was going to be an entire series about his life. But of course, you start with his birth. And at the time, and this is very interesting based upon what I have discovered over 30 years of research, is at the time he thought to himself, he's figuring out, so how do I tell the nativity story in such a way that it keeps people's interest? Because everybody already knows it. Okay, now stop right there, because it took me 20 years before I realized that is a simple, very understandable, but it's an error, right? Because what he assumed, what I assumed, is that the date changed, but the story didn't. And what I discovered over 35 years of research is that when you correct the misconception that Jesus was born on the 25th of December, it reveals another misconception. And then when you correct that misconception, it reveals another one, and then it just keeps going and going and going and going. And finally, after 20 years of research, I went, wait a second. The traditional story is like full of holes. I mean, full of holes, not just one or two, but it's like full of holes. And then to top it all off, I discovered the source of the traditional biblical. Check that. I discovered the source of the traditional nativity story and discovered that it didn't come from the Bible.
Right. So where did it come from?
It's from a book called the Proto-Evangelium of James. And the Proto-Evangelium of James is an apocryphal book, okay, or you could call it apocryphal. Another word for it is pseudepigraphal. And what those words mean is that they are books that were written outside of the Bible. They were not written by biblical writers. They're outside the canon of the Bible, and yet they are usually falsely ascribed to biblical characters or biblical themes. Okay, so the Proto-Evangelium of James, it's also known as the Gospel of James. It's also known as the Infancy Gospel of James, is attributed to James, the Lord's brother. That's the James we mean, right? The problem is that through historical and literary research, we can analyze the style of language being used in the book, and we can discover that, it was written somewhere between 150 and 200 AD. So it wasn't written within James' lifetime.
Right.
It's not possible that it was written by James. And therefore, that right there, I mean, that to a lot of people is enough right there. Whoever did write it had the nerve to try to ascribe it to the Lord's brother to make it seem more credible.
Right.
Okay. But a lot of the components of the traditional nativity story come from this book.
Very interesting. So please continue.
Okay, well, let's give a couple of examples, right? So as an example, the notion that Mary rode on the back of a donkey comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James, okay? Now, that's problematic for a couple of reasons. How pregnant was she when she rode the donkey?
Yeah, I've thought about that too, because, it's not like here we are in the 21st century and we're in a car, you put the woman that's water has broke, or she's going into labor, and you put her in the car and you get her to the hospital. If she's traveling in that day and time, like you said, on a donkey or something, and she's very pregnant, let's put it that way,
right?
And she traveling that way at that day and time would be absolutely tedious, to put it lightly.
Right. Yeah, that's so that was kind of the first clue. Is I went, wait a second, because I've seen some really excellent biblical production or biblical productions. Just call it productions. It's not biblical. That's the problem. I've seen some really excellent productions of the traditional nativity story. Some that even use live animals, right? And I still have the picture in my head of this of a donkey coming in a live production, right? And the donkey comes into the scene. Mary is on the back of the donkey. Joseph is leading the donkey. Now, of course, the woman who's playing Mary isn't really pregnant, of course.
Right.
But in the play, she's having contractions on the back of the donkey.
Yeah.
And at the time, it just never even occurred to me. I was too young in the word, naive. But over time, I went, that's insane.
Yeah.
You're not going to ride a donkey at anything after 8 months. Even before that is highly questionable, but certainly once you hit about 8 months. Now, interestingly enough, and we don't have to go there now, we can go there later or set it aside for the moment.
Yeah.
I actually think they traveled way early in her pregnancy. I don't think that she was past 4 months pregnant when they traveled, because
that would be the wise thing to do.
Right. Well, you're like going to be one of the first people that I tell this to.
Okay.
Another concept that is in the Proto-Evangelium that I believe is wholly inaccurate is that Mary was publicly discovered to be pregnant. Okay. There's no way she was publicly discovered to be pregnant. I do not believe that. And that's straight from the Proto-Evangelium of James. Contrarily, when you read the scripture, okay, I don't have it memorized, unfortunately, but there's two segments in the Gospels where something happened to Mary, and she wasn't the only one who knew it, okay?
Okay.
But it very explicitly says, and Mary kept this to herself. Okay? Now, the point there being is that although there were others that did know, and maybe they did tell people, Mary was a secretive person.
Okay.
Okay? And her reputation, and frankly, her life
would be in danger.
Right, let alone the entire story of redemption relied on her not being discovered. Okay? So therefore, what in the work I've done over 30 years, we all know that she discovers that she's pregnant and she takes off to visit her cousin Elizabeth, right? Her relative Elizabeth. She's there for 3 months and then she comes back. Okay. I believe she came back because she was already betrothed to Joseph, right? And that the nuptials were near. Now I'm getting in really deep, really fast because in a Jewish wedding, okay, there were two predominant segments. There was the betrothal, and then there was the nuptials, okay? So the betrothal is the actual contractual component. The
legal end of it?
The legal end
part.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. In other words, there literally would be a wedding contract, and it would be read, and both parties would agree to it, and then they would drink a cup of wine, signifying that the couple is betrothed, okay?
Got it.
And they were in all effect married at that point. Okay. Betrothed has a much more significant emphasis behind it than simply engaged. Okay.
And the way that we would think of it here in the Western world in the 21st century.
Correct. Right. Now, but what was interesting about their tradition, right? How they did it was then the groom would take off for typically 1 year to go build the wedding chamber. Okay. Which is where the nuptials would take place. Okay. Which is really interesting because we know that Joseph was a teknon, a builder, not just a carpenter, a builder, okay, which means he would have been skilled in working with stone, metal, and wood. So he was perfectly qualified to go build this wedding chamber. And typically, the betrothed couple hardly sees each other. They might bump into each other publicly occasionally, but the whole point is that they're going off and what's the word I want to use? They're secluding themselves, and they are, help me out here, Kevin. What's the word I'm searching for? They're
segregating or
no, come on. Oh, geez. Age is a killer. They're consecrating. That's the word I want.
Okay. Yeah.
They're consecrating themselves, getting ready for when they will have the nuptials a year ago. Well, I believe I can't prove it, absolutely, but I believe in this case that the reason Mary went back to Nazareth after having visited Elizabeth is because the nuptials were approaching. Now, she doesn't know exactly when they're going to be. That's part of the Jewish tradition, is that she doesn't know exactly when that's going to happen. But if it's been upwards to a year, she knows it's creeping up on her really fast.
It's going to be very soon.
It's going to be very soon. So what I think happened is that she went to visit Elizabeth for 3 months. She came back, and within 30 days, maybe 60 at the most, but within 30 days of her arriving back in Nazareth, she and Joseph are married. She tells Joseph that she's pregnant. Okay. The two of them decide that they must leave Nazareth. They do not plan on staying. They've got to move. They've got to leave because they cannot risk Mary being publicly discovered.
Right.
Okay. And also because, see, here's a key. Everybody has to believe that Joseph is the father.
Right.
Okay. And not just the adopted father. They've got to believe he is the father.
Is the father.
Yeah. Right.
Because if my memory's correct, in that day and time, in that culture, for her to be discovered like that, she could have been stoned to death, correct?
Correct. She could have been. Yeah. It's unlikely because by the time that came about, the practice of stoning for adultery wasn't really emphasized that much anymore. So it's kind of unlikely. But at the same time, you never know. You never know. Who you tell. I mean, in the Proto-Evangelium, the story they tell is really bizarre because in that one, when they are publicly discovered, quote unquote, the authorities throw a fit and bring them up on charges of committing a crime, which is just bizarre as all get out. But like I said, back to the timeline that I think really happened, she visits Elizabeth, she comes back, they go through the nuptials, they decide that they must leave, because Joseph at first is, when Mary tells him, at first he's going to divorce her quietly, right?
Yeah.
And then the angel of the Lord speaks to him in the dream, Gabriel speaks to him in a dream and says, no.
Yeah.
Flip it over. Don't divorce her. You got to marry her. You got to follow through. You got to marry her.
You got to follow through because she didn't commit adultery.
Because she didn't commit adultery. And by the way, your son, quote unquote, is going to be the Messiah and he's going to save like all mankind. So this is kind of important, right? But now the question becomes, okay, how do we leave Nazareth without attracting attention, right? And this is another reason why I believe she wasn't that far along.
Also, couldn't they have used the taxation that was going out as a cover story?
Yeah, exactly.
We have records. We have extant records that are still in existence showing the actual decrees going out for the taxation, and that these people had to do what they talked about in the Bible and the Gospels.
Sure. Now, this quote unquote taxation was unique. Okay, because one of the things we have to remember about this is that the Romans were experts at taking a census, and they were experts at taxation. They had a very typical format for doing it, and they also kept excellent records.
Right.
So here's the challenge. Let's go look for the records of a taxation or a census right about 3 BC, right?
Right.
Can't find one.
Can't find it.
No, it's like it's not there. So, but there are hints in the Bible that this wasn't a normal census.
Yes.
Okay. That's the key. Okay. Because for one thing, they had to travel for this one. Right. So if all they're doing is counting heads, what's the big deal? Why do they have to travel? Why do they have to go to their ancestral hometown? Okay. So that's question number one. And then number two, when you read the text carefully, Mary had to travel as well. It wasn't just Joseph. It wasn't just the head of the household. Mary had to go as well. Okay. So why would that be true? So that's got to tell us something. Why would Mary have to travel? Okay. And the answer to that question is because both of them were of the house and lineage of David.
Exactly.
Right. So these, although they lived, now a lot of people want to call them peasants. Okay. And I'm not really fond of that word because there were a lot of Judeans that were impoverished, but it wasn't because they were the lowest of the lows necessarily. Not that those kind of people didn't exist, because clearly they did. But Joseph, like I just said, was a teknon, a builder, right? It's really unfair to call him a carpenter. And same is true with Jesus himself. When he was raised by Joseph, he was a teknon. And teknon, like I mentioned earlier, means they would have been skilled in stone, metal, and wood, right?
Yeah.
They built buildings, not just tables and chairs and things like that. And so that, and also the quote unquote city on a hill is actually the city of Sepphoris, which was about 4 miles from Galilee, which was significantly larger. And Herod the Great was a very talented builder, okay, himself, and had these massive projects all over Judea. And Sepphoris would have been an area where there would have been a ton of work. So Joseph never would have lacked work just 4 miles up the road.
Right.
So the irony is that he would have made good money. It's just that he would have been taxed into oblivion by Herod. So it wasn't that they were just peasants. It's they were impoverished because of the confiscatory taxes.
Right.
Okay?
Gee, that still goes on today, doesn't it?
Yep. That sounds kind of familiar.
Sounds very
right?
familiar.
Sounds
But
very
please
familiar.
continue.
But let's see now. Let's see if I can get back to my train of thought there, because it's
Go
so
right ahead.
easy to just keep going
Yeah.
on tangents, one after the other, because this
Right.
is so exciting. But so like we were talking about, people had to believe that Joseph was the father. They had to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Mary was ever publicly discovered. As a matter of
Right.
fact, okay, let's go ahead. I'll just blow your mind. I think Mary told Joseph on their wedding night.
Why do you think that?
Because it was the perfect opportunity to keep it a secret.
Hmm.
Okay, because when the nuptials occur, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's in the wedding chamber. See, so you got the betrothal, right? Then a year
Yeah.
goes by while the groom builds the chuppah, the wedding chamber, and then on a day and hour that is unknown to the bride, he grabs his groomsmen and they make this big party, and they make all kinds of noise with trumpets and everything, this big celebration, and they go and they steal the bride. Okay. Now, because it was culturally, everybody knew this wasn't some surprise.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
we
it's
were
not,
expecting it to happen.
right. They're expecting it to happen. So it's not a literal kidnapping, but they show up at the home of the father of the bride, and then the groom steals away his bride, his wife to be, and they go back to the wedding chamber with all the celebration and all the noise and everything like that, where they consummate the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I can just see it in my head that they're in the wedding chamber and we all know what's supposed to happen next, and Mary says,
Right.
by the way, I got to tell you something. It's really
Mm-hmm.
important. But they're in the wedding chamber. And no one's going to disturb them. No one's going to go in there, right? And guess what? What a perfect opportunity for her to tell him, right?
Right. Right.
Now, and then when she does tell him, the English translation of the scripture just does not do it justice. He was furious.
Right.
Okay, he was just out of his mind, angry at what had just happened.
Right.
But he apparently, manages to maintain his composure well enough that it's like, okay, fine, I'm really ticked off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm gonna go to sleep. You sleep over there, I'm gonna sleep over here, and I'm gonna go to sleep. Because you steal your bride away at midnight, right? So by the time all this transpires, in my opinion, right? What is it now? 3 or 4 in the morning? Right? Well, I got to get some sleep. I'm just beside myself. I got to get some sleep. So Joseph rolls over and goes to sleep, and bingo, an angel appears to him in the dream and says, take Mary as your wife, right? So, and this is another interesting component of the story, is because, see, he wakes up and they consummate the marriage.
Yes.
Which is critical. It's absolutely critical to the messiahship of Jesus Christ. Okay? Because they had to be legally married, which means, and this is amazing because when you know the detail, it's just stinking amazing, because after the nuptials happen and the consummation happens, the groom has to reach through the door to the chuppah and hand the best man the tokens of virginity.
Yeah.
Okay. Which Mary was, because it was a virgin conception.
And there was the proof.
And there was the proof, right? But contrary to certain denominational beliefs, and also the way we typically read the scriptural account, because it says, and Joseph didn't know his wife until she had brought forth her firstborn child. People think that means he did not have sexual relations with her. And that's not what the word know means. The word know means to have sexual relations to the point of pregnancy.
Got it.
Because every time you read that in scripture, it's so-and-so knew his wife and she conceived. So-and-so knew his wife and she conceived, right? Every time, without an exception. So they consummated the marriage, and therefore he did not know her until she had brought forth her firstborn child. It actually makes
and it's interesting to point out is that it's God's only and her firstborn, which implies that she had children afterwards. And there's also scriptural evidence to back that up because they talk about the other children that she had later on in the Gospels.
Correct. Absolutely. And they were not Joseph's children from a previous marriage, which that's also the Proto-Evangelium of James.
Right.
Is that he was much older, a widow, and that Jesus's siblings were therefore these children from the other marriage. So, but I remembered the tangent we got off on, which is that we were talking about the registration. Okay.
Got it.
And thank you, because I mean, you finished my sentence. I didn't even get to the big surprise that this was a very special registration. Okay.
Okay.
The Greek word there can be translated census. It can be translated taxation, but most appropriately, it's simply a registration. Okay, which could mean collecting money, or it could mean that they're counting heads, but it's really a registration. And talk about the timing for a moment. Just like you hypothesized a second ago, that's exactly what I think happened, is that once again, she visits Elizabeth, she comes back, the nuptials happen, she tells Joseph, they're devising a plan, they decide to leave Nazareth, they can't really figure out how to do that, and then bang, this decree comes out from Augustus Caesar that every notable citizen, that's the key word, every notable citizen in the provinces and the client kingdoms must register, and that is Joseph and Mary, because they were both of the house and lineage of David. So it required them to travel to the ancestral hometown.
Got it. So it would earmark them as opposed to a common peasant.
Exactly. And so, yeah, exactly. That's why I say I don't like the phrase peasant, because they were, number one, they were Judeans. They were of the tribe of Judah, which is the royal tribe. And then both of them were directly descended from David. Okay. From David. I mean, and that's King David. That's a big deal, right?
It's royal lineage.
Yeah, they're royals. They are royals, straight up, right? So we miss that because we just think, oh, they were, I do, and they really weren't commoners. That's not true either. But I prefer that to peasant, right?
Got it.
That socially, in a Roman-dominated society, with Herod as the pretender king, the appointed king of the Jews, quote unquote, they would have had the appearance of being a commoner, but in reality, they were royals.
Okay, so where would you like to take this to next?
Well, I mean, we can go a lot of places. I mean, we can keep talking about, the fact that this is, in my opinion, this is the story, right? Yeah. This is the story. But we can change gears. We can talk about the date that he really
the date. Let's do the date. Let's do that. Let's do the date. How do we arrive at that date of September 11, 3 BC, or according to maybe what calendar you're looking at, 2 BC?
Okay. Well, I think it's in the Bible. Okay. Now this is interesting because when you present this information to people who have never heard it before, you get a couple of different reactions. Some people are shocked. Some people are like, "Oh my God!" and it's like you stab them in the heart with a spoon, because they think you're assaulting their cherished, quote unquote Christmas traditions, and not really. I'm just trying to read the Bible and tell the story as it happened. Okay, so some people are truly shocked because they've been fed the traditional story their entire life. They don't know better. Other people are like, "Really? Where'd you get that idea? What's your evidence? Tell me. I'm curious," right? And that's what happened to me 35 years ago. Is it didn't shock me. It was like, oh, all right, what you got? Lay it on me. Tell me, right? So, but the reason I bring up that contrast is because we make a lot of assumptions. The traditional nativity story is so ingrained in our collective psyche that we make a lot of assumptions without even realizing it.
And I think, too, to add to what you're saying, is that even somebody who's an agnostic or of a different religion or is even an atheist, they all know the story. They all know when you talk about the
Yes.
nativity, they get that image in their head.
Right, that Jesus was born in a stable, and because there was no room in the Motel 6, and there were animals around, and manure and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And sorry, that's just not what happened.
Yeah.
But at any rate, getting back to the date and how people respond. So one of the assumptions we make is that the Bible tells us he was born on December 25th, and it doesn't.
It doesn't. No,
It doesn't. It's not there at all. It's not explicit. Neither is it implicit. It doesn't even imply that he was born on December 25th. So that's really interesting as well. So how am I so confident that I know the date? And that's because I believe it is in the Bible, but I believe it's cryptic. That is the point. It's cryptic. You've got to decode what the Bible is saying. And if you understand how the Jews interpret Scripture, the fact that there would be a cryptic, that you would have to decipher a code, is not unusual at all. And the code that we are deciphering is in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, which tells us that John saw a sign in the heavens, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And for those of us that are already familiar with this, we recognize that that's a sign. When John says in the heavens, he means the night sky.
Right.
And that the woman is the constellation Virgo, and the crown is the constellation Leo. And so we actually have a pretty explicit description of what to look for. Now, I should mention right away that it's not a third sign, it's just an additional reference. I believe it refers to the same sign.
Okay.
Which is Genesis 49:10. Okay. Genesis 49:10 is Jacob prophesying over his sons, and he prophesies over Judah, and he prophesies that Judah will be the royal tribe. And he says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And it's frankly a little bit complicated, but I believe that is yet again another reference to an astronomical sign, and it is a reference to the asterism that we call Leo, right? But in addition, it's also a reference to the planet Jupiter and the star Regulus. That is the lawgiver and the between his feet. See, because the star Regulus, if you're at all familiar with it, and you can do this on an astronomy, computer program, or even just a star chart, when you look at the quote unquote pictures, right? Which
the constellations,
right? Regulus is between Leo's feet. And on this particular date, this is the reason you can track it down to September 11, 3 BC, is on this particular date, the planet Jupiter, which is the king planet, is in conjunction with Regulus, the king star, in the constellation of Leo. So that right there is a pretty heavy duty sign. But then when you combine it with a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and you realize that these two constellations are right next to each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you start going, wait a second, time out. What the heck is going on here? Because that is not a coincidence. Okay. That all these details start to drop in one at a time. Okay. Because I'll describe it here in a second, but the woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, that's actually relatively common. Okay. But when you add the crown of 12 stars, now it makes it extraordinarily uncommon. Now you have a sign that only occurs every couple of thousand years.
Okay, so that would make it very rare, and for it to happen at that particular point in time would be miraculous.
Exactly, right. The timing, obviously God set the sun and the moon and the stars in their courses. I mean, he tells us that in Genesis 1:14, that the stars are for signs and seasons and days and years. And so It says in the Bible,
Yeah.
this is what the stars are for. It tells us, right? Slap you in the face.
Yeah.
The stars are for signs and seasons and days and years.
I think it's what, like you said, Genesis 1:14, right?
1:14, yeah.
Yeah.
And so now John is having, he's having a vision, but nonetheless, he saw this in the night sky, that you've got this spectacular sign. So the woman clothed with the sun, right?
Yes.
Is the constellation Virgo. Okay. And if you can imagine my arm being the woman, with this as being her head and this as being her feet, she's actually turned upside down like this.
Okay.
And her head is down here and her feet are up here. And the horizon is running right through the middle of her body.
Okay.
Okay. So the setting sun is right here in the middle of her body. That's a woman clothed with the sun.
Right in her belly.
Right smack in her belly. Right smack in the middle of her body. It's a woman clothed with the sun. And then over here, got to do this for the camera. It's backwards on the camera. Over here is the setting moon. The moon is under her feet. Okay. So that's the woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet. Now that is relatively common. Okay. It's not extraordinarily uncommon. It's relatively common. But for the moon to be under her feet, they've actually got to be under her feet. Okay. The moon can't be in the middle of her body, for example, or by her head, because that wouldn't be the moon under her feet.
Yeah, so, and to think about the perspectives too, the moon is a heck of a lot closer to Earth than the stars are. They're millions and millions of miles away. The moon is about 250,000 miles away.
Exactly. So you can plug these parameters into a computer program, okay, and discover, say, okay, I want to, and I'm kind of jumping ahead.
Go ahead.
But if you said, I want to see the western horizon visible from Jerusalem, which is the same as Bethlehem, they're only 6 miles apart.
Yeah.
From Jerusalem, the night sky, setting sun, September 11th, 3 BC, you find that sign.
You'll find it.
Yep, you'll find it. Now, if you try to look any other date, like if you only go 24 hours in front or in back, you don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is also the reason now, and I understand why you said this earlier in the program. There are some people that think this happened in 2 BC. I'm not going to argue very heavily with them. Okay. Because I understand their reasoning, and we don't have every detail we need yet. This is an ongoing investigation, right?
Yeah.
But this is another reason I think it is 3 BC, is because the woman clothed with the sun, the moon underneath her feet, and the crown of 12 stars, that occurred in 3 BC.
Got it.
I'm pretty sure it didn't.
That would make sense. Now, what I want to focus on here, and I think it's important, is because it's a part of the nativity, and we talk about the quote 3 wise men, and I know for a fact that it wasn't 3, and there's reasons we can go into, but what I want to make sure that we know about is, when did they arrive? But even before we get to that, why there wasn't just 3, and even before that, what is it that they saw in the night sky that said, we need to leave Iran and go to Jerusalem?
Right. Now, we would need an entire additional segment to do all of that.
Or maybe 2 or 3.
But I'll burn through some of it, okay?
Okay.
Now, one of the things that like I said, this is an ongoing investigation. So it's been going on for at least 35 years in my life, let alone all the other people that are researching it, right? Because we're not alone. There's a lot of people that are digging into this, trying to figure out what happened. I don't know that the sign I just described was seen by the Magi.
Okay.
It may have been. It may not have been. We're not sure. Okay. Maybe they did. It's entirely possible that they did. But when you try to decipher what the Magi saw, it's very important to understand, what were they looking for? Okay.
Exactly.
So in other words, what we have to do is we have to engage in a study of what is known as archaeoastronomy. And archaeoastronomy is a big fancy word that simply means, what ancient cultures knew and understood and believed about astronomy. Okay. And we're talking about a part of the world, Mesopotamia. Okay. which is where the Magi were from. But that is a part of the world where the study of astronomy, for a lack of a better word, is where it was born, right?
Okay.
And at first it was very crude because the ancients, I mean, we're talking 1000 BC, 1500 BC, 2000 BC,
Right.
they hadn't figured out yet that the sky was three-dimensional.
Got it.
Okay. So they didn't know that when they saw a group of stars, that group of stars was not gravitationally grouped. You got one here, one here, one here, right? But from our visual point of view, they make a group, right? So most truly ancient astronomy, up until the Greeks, it was the Greeks that put together that it was three-dimensional. Okay.
Got it.
So most ancient astronomy, up until the Greeks, astronomy was almost exclusively math-based.
Mhm.
Okay, not geometry-based, not three-dimensional, two-dimensional. Okay, so if we ask ourselves the question, well, how did the Magi engage in their study of astronomy? What is it they did?
Right.
And what is it
Right.
they looked for? And does that match the record in Scripture? Okay. One of the things they truly emphasized was they watched for what is known as the heliacal risings of certain planets. Okay. Now, what that means is it's from the Greek word helios, which is the word for the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So a heliacal rising is the rising of a planet above the horizon in the morning sky before the sun pops up and the brightness of the sun
Before sunrise.
occludes the star, right? So they tracked the heliacal risings of the various planets. Now, they didn't know they were planets. They simply called them stars. Everything was a star, right? Because that was just all they knew. Now, we understand them to be planets. But in particular, they tracked the heliacal risings of Venus and Jupiter, okay?
Jupiter.
And because they were some of the most notable, they were some of the brightest in the morning sky, right?
Yep.
So when one of those and a true heliacal rising is the first day that happens each season. Okay. Now it will happen for several days, right? So if Venus pops up above the horizon before sunrise, on Tuesday, August 28th, it's going to do it on the 29th and the 30th and et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But what's going to happen is over time, the rotation will make Venus further and further away from it. I forget if I got it. It's one of the two. It either gets further and further.
And it's because nothing is stationary.
Exactly.
We're on a planet that's moving. Venus is moving, and we're at different distances from the sun.
Exactly.
So things you have to look at it's relative.
So in other words, the different orbits mean that within a few days you're not going to see that anymore.
Exactly.
Okay, right? Either because it got too far from the sun or too close to the sun. I forget which. But within a few days, you're not going to see it anymore. So what they would do is they would track that and they'd say, okay, well, this year, the heliacal rising was on this day. This year, it was on this day. This year, it was on this day. This year, it was on this day, right? And they meticulously recorded that. So there is a collection of clay tablets in the British Museum in London that's what this is. It's the astronomical records of the ancient Babylonians. Okay, now we're talking, my God, 1,500 years later, but we managed to find these clay tablets 2,000 years after that.
Wow.
Okay, so there's this one in particular in the British Museum in London known as the Venus tablet of Misaduca, okay, which is a record of the heliacal risings of Venus. So we know this is what the Magi looked for. That's what made sense to them. They looked for the heliacal risings of stars. So then when you get to the record in Matthew, where they show up at the court of Herod the Great, and they say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east. In the Greek, that is the word for the heliacal rising of a star. It's not just the generic direction east. Okay, it means in the rising, in its rising, in a heliacal rising. So
when it's coming above the equator and you can see it.
Or the horizon, rather.
Or the horizon, excuse me.
It's popped up above the horizon before the sun, so it's like super bright, right? And like I said, the first
and the
day
thing that I want
happens
to stress
season,
here too is that you have, if it was 3 guys that showed up,
right,
and they're saying that to Herod, and
right,
I really don't think Herod was that nice of a guy.
No,
so
Herod was not.
I really don't.
No, of course not.
It says in Scripture that it says that there was a great, quote, uproar in the city when they appeared. 3 men showing up and wanting to see Herod and saying that isn't going to happen. He would probably just haul them off and chop off their heads.
Precisely.
What caused the uproar, and what is it about them that would make that scenario of him cutting off their heads not happen?
It's who the Magi really are. Okay. So I can't get into the history of the Magi. I kind of got to give you the punchline.
Yeah.
By the time of Christ, the Magi were known as the House of Majestines.
Okay.
And they were the upper house of Parthian parliament. Now, Parthia, most people don't even know what Parthia is. Parthia is the other major superpower in the region. Rome is one superpower. Parthia is the other. And the frontier between the two superpowers is Judea. Okay. At the time of Christ, Rome controlled Rome controlled Judea, but 35 to 40 years earlier, Parthia controlled Judea.
Got it.
Okay. So this is part of the bigger picture. Herod, when Herod was appointed king of the Jews by Rome, Rome did not control Judea.
Got it.
They technically didn't have it to give.
But also, they from what I understand, it was like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people that walked into the city because they traveled with their own army. Correct.
Yeah, that's
why nobody would touch him. That's why he thought he was probably being invaded.
Right. See that, that's the point I'm getting to.
Yeah.
So when Herod was appointed king, see what happened was the very reason Herod got appointed king is because the Parthians invaded Judea and drove the Romans and the Roman appointees out. So Herod fled to Alexandria, Egypt first to try to meet his good friend Mark Antony, the Roman general Mark Antony. He didn't find him there, so Cleopatra puts him on a ship for Rome, where he does, because these are all contemporaries, and he was his friend. Herod and Antony were friends. So he meets Antony in Rome. Antony introduces him to Augustus, and then Augustus and Antony take him to the Senate and say, hey, this would be the perfect client king in Judea. Let's make him king. So they do, right? But the problem is that the Parthians control Judea. So the Romans give Herod 11 Roman legions to militarily retake Judea from the Parthians. And it takes him 3 years to reconquer the country. So he does. But you are absolutely correct, because now you got to fast forward 35 years later. Rome controls Judea. Parthia is the superpower right next door. And the Majestines, who everybody knows who they are. That's another reason it wasn't 3 wise guys on camels. Okay. Everybody knows who these guys are. Their job description in Parthia is they appoint kings. Okay. In Parthia, they had an unusual practice that was not common in that part of the world in the ancient culture. Most ancient cultures practiced what is called the Rite of Primogeniture. And the Rite of Primogeniture means when the king dies, his oldest son becomes king.
Right.
The Parthians didn't do that. That's the problem. They didn't do that. Okay. In Parthia, when the king dies, the Magi determine who the next king is. Okay. They consult the genealogies. They consult the stars. They find out whether anybody had a significant dream about it or not. And then they appoint the next king.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why the Romans, when you had battles going on about, who was going to be in power, that's why they would wipe out whole families.
Exactly. Well, and it's funny because, oh, go figure, the king of Parthia had just died, by the way.
Okay.
Okay, so that makes complete sense. That
Mhm.
Phraates the fourth? No, not Phraates. Yeah, Phraates the fourth. Phraates the fourth of Parthia had just died, so the Majestines are determining who the next king is going to be, and
Mhm.
apparently they determined that the next king would be this young Judean. Okay,
Okay.
so now you have to imagine this, and you're absolutely correct. They've got to travel from their capital in Ctesiphon, which would be modern day Iran, okay, on the Euphrates River. Would take about a month to make the journey, but they would have traveled into Roman territory. Okay, you don't do that without military escort.
And also, they were traveling with some pretty valuable stuff, and you wouldn't travel down the Silk Road or areas like that alone with three people with a lot of value,
No,
with people wanting to rob you and everything else. But if you have an army of a few thousand,
right.
nobody's going to even come near you. They're not even going to bother.
No,
They're
exactly.
going to pass you by, and they're going to go find somebody else to rob.
Plus, this is an Eastern culture that at one time we would have said that they were Orientals, right?
Yes.
Because they're east of Constantinople, right?
Right.
The Magi traveled in tremendous pomp and circumstance. Everybody knew they were on the road when they were traveling.
Now, is it true that when they came into the city, it took hours and hours and hours for them to get in?
Yeah, there. I have a record that speaks of the fact that, see, and I truly believe they would have. So the Silk Road was a network of roads throughout the East. Okay,
Yeah.
they would have traveled. They would have followed the Silk Road northwest along the Euphrates River until they got to the city of Rasafa, where they would have met up with the King's Highway, which goes from Rasafa all the way down to Egypt. They would have followed the King's Road through Damascus. Okay. And boy, can we talk about that, but we're going to run out of time.
Yeah. We got probably about 3 minutes. So
Right.
anything you haven't covered that you'd like to get out on the air, do it right now before we go bye-bye.
Well, let me just hit you with that last detail,
Sure.
and that is the Esther Gate in Damascus, which still stands today. Okay. The Esther Gate in Damascus, if we had, I have pictures of it, I just didn't arrange to get them up on screen here. But when you look at the Esther Gate, it had three portals, right? The main one in the middle, which would have been big enough for carts and horses and stuff like that, and then two on the side that individuals could have walked through. The record I have says that it took them from before sunrise until afternoon for the procession to pass through the Esther Gate in Damascus.
Wow. And everybody's, then the word of mouth is going like crazy. And that's, of course, getting to Herod. And
Correct.
Everybody's flipping out because you got this huge entourage coming in and nobody really knows why.
Right. And even though it's been 35 years, Herod has already fought them. And they're like we said, their job is that they are kingmakers. So now it takes that quaint biblical phrase that we just blow right past.
Yeah.
Where is he who was born King of the Jews?
Yeah.
For we have seen his star in the east, and we are come to worship him. And then, like you said, it says, and Herod and all Jerusalem was greatly troubled.
Yeah, or in an uproar. It's unreal.
They were in an uproar because an army had come to invade.
Yes.
And appoint a new king.
And Herod thought that they were going to be unappointing him.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very interesting. It's very interesting stuff. And so I got a few minutes more. What else would you like to get out on the air? I want to see, I'm trying to limit this because this subject, I could sit here and talk to you for the next 5-6 hours and I got limited time. So I'm trying to get the good stuff out on the air,
right. Well, on one hand, we absolutely want to get the good stuff out on the air. On the other hand, we don't want to give away too many punchlines in one episode because then we can't do other episodes. But, I would say that the summary is, as we have already indicated, is that the real story is really quite different than the traditional
Very much
story.
different.
very much different. A lot of the basics are the same. Sure, yeah, Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem. That remains the same. That didn't change. Yeah, the Magi showed up. That, now how they showed up and when and their numbers is radically different. But the fact that the Magi showed up, is the same, right? The shepherds, the angels. So in the super, super, super broad strokes, it's the same story. But in the details, it's not. It's
and
not.
We'll leave. We don't have
all.
the time to get into it, but we'll leave this for another time for people to ponder. The wise men were not at the nativity.
Yeah, no, correct. Yeah, and that we didn't.
They were not there.
They were not there.
They arrived later.
Yep.
Much later.
Yep.
And,
now it makes your nativity set much more symmetrical to have the shepherds on one side and the Magi on the other. But no, they arrived 15 months later.
Yeah. Hey, Tim, thank you. We're going to have to do another show soon and really keep exploring this subject because it is absolutely fascinating. And when you start putting all the pieces together, it really gives you like you were saying, a much more interesting picture of what was going on than what we're traditionally taught.
Yeah.
And that seems bland by comparison. So, folks, I'm Kevin Gallagher. I want to thank Tim Kynes for joining us here tonight. And you can catch us every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. here in Connecticut. You can also go out to timeoutyoutube.com, and you can see shows there going back almost 25 years. And we hope you enjoyed the show tonight. We are going to pursue this even more because I think it's a fascinating subject. And Tim, we've barely even touched the tip of the iceberg. So, folks, when September 11 rolls around, give it a thought. Think about what was going on
September 7th this year.
September 7th this year, but in the time that he was born, it was September the 11th. And so think about that, think on that, and it should make some interesting thought. I'm Kevin Gallagher. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. As always, check us out. We play weekly radio, and that's Friday nights at 9 p.m. on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And that's it. Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll be back again next week.